Hello, and welcome to The Restful Historian. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are standing on a London street corner on a cold November morning in the year 1888. The air is thick with fog, so dense you can barely see 10 feet ahead. It is not the clean, romantic mist of a countryside dawn. This fog tastes of coal smoke and carries the smell of horse manure, rotting vegetables, and something else, something sour and human that you cannot quite name. The street beneath your boots is slick with mud and waste. Around you, the city is already awake. Factory whistles shriek in the distance. The iron wheels of carts grind over cobblestones, creating a constant rumble that never stops, day or night. Somewhere nearby, a child is crying. A man shouts. A woman laughs, harsh and bitter. This is Victorian London, the greatest city in the world, the beating heart of the British Empire. And it is nothing like the stories you have been told. Tonight, we will walk these streets together. Not the London of Sherlock Holmes with his clean sitting room and his faithful Watson. Not the London of Christmas cards with rosy-cheeked carolers and gentle snow. We will see the real city, the one that Charles Dickens walked through and wrote about, the one that most Victorians tried very hard to ignore. We will meet the people who lived in the shadows of those grand buildings, the children who worked in the darkness, the women who had no choices, and the men who built an empire on the backs of the desperate. But before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple way to support this work, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you are joining me tonight. So please, leave a comment and let me know. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us step back in time, into the gas-lit streets, the smoke-filled air, and the complex, troubled heart of Victorian London. The city we are entering tonight is a study in extremes. It is a place of breathtaking wealth and unimaginable poverty, often existing side by side, separated only by a single street or a stone wall. To understand Victorian London, you must first understand that it was not one city, but two cities occupying the same space. And the people who lived in one world often pretended the other did not exist at all. Let us begin our journey in the West End, in the wealthy heart of London. It is evening, around 7 o'clock, and the streets are coming alive with a different kind of energy. Gas lamps are being lit by the lamplighters, their long poles reaching up to ignite the jets of flame that will burn through the night. The light they cast is warm and yellow, creating pools of golden glow in the darkness. This is the London of the wealthy, the London of the upper and middle classes who benefited most from Britain's vast empire. Walk down Regent Street or Piccadilly and you will see grand shops with massive plate glass windows, a recent innovation that allows passers-by to gaze at the goods displayed within. There are department stores like Fortnum and Mason, founded in 1707 but reaching new heights of luxury in the Victorian era. Inside you can buy tea from India, silk from China, spices from the Caribbean, all the fruits of empire laid out for those who can afford them. The streets are wide and clean here, relatively speaking. There are crossings swept clear of horse manure by crossing sweepers, usually children or elderly people who survive on the pennies tossed to them by grateful pedestrians. The buildings are tall and elegant, their facades decorated with columns and carvings. The people who walk these streets are dressed in the height of fashion. The men wear dark suits, top hats, and carry walking sticks. The women wear elaborate dresses with bustles, their waists cinched impossibly tight by corsets, their hands gloved, their faces shaded by parasols even in the evening. If you follow one of these wealthy families home, you might end up in Belgravia or Mayfair, where the townhouses are 4 or 5 stories tall, built of pale stone with iron railings and small front gardens. Inside these homes are marvels of Victorian technology and taste. They have running water, though it must be heated by servants. They have indoor toilets, a luxury that most Londoners cannot imagine. The rooms are stuffed with furniture, with heavy curtains, with ornaments and paintings, and every surface covered in cloth or lace. This is the Victorian aesthetic, abundance and decoration. Every inch of space filled with proof of wealth and taste. These wealthy homes are run by armies of servants. A truly grand household might employ 20 or 30 people. There are butlers and housekeepers, ladies' maids and valets, cooks and kitchen maids, footmen and coachmen, scullery maids and laundry maids. Below stairs, in the basement and attic rooms where the servants live, there exists an entirely separate world with its own rigid hierarchy. The servants work 16-hour days, starting before dawn to light fires and heat water, ending late at night after the family has gone to bed. They are paid a few pounds a year, plus their board and lodging. They are expected to be invisible, to appear only when summoned, to have no lives of their own. This is the London that the world saw, the London that was photographed and painted and written about in fashionable magazines. This is the London that hosted the Great Exhibition of 1851 in the Crystal Palace, a massive glass and iron structure that showcased Britain's industrial might and imperial reach to the world. This is the London of theatres and opera houses, of gentlemen's clubs and exclusive restaurants. This is the London that believed itself to be the centre of civilization, the most advanced city in the most powerful nation on earth. But if you walk east from Piccadilly, if you follow the curve of the Thames as it winds through the city, you will find that the streets begin to change. Gradually at first, then with shocking speed, you enter a different world entirely. The buildings grow taller and closer together, blocking out the light. The streets narrow into alleys and courts. The gas lamps become fewer and farther between, and then disappear altogether, leaving entire neighbourhoods in darkness after sunset. The smell hits you first. It is overwhelming, a physical presence in the air. It is the smell of too many people living in too small a space with no sanitation. It is the smell of industrial pollution, of the tanneries that cure leather in vats of urine and faeces, of the bone boilers who render animal carcasses into glue and fertiliser, of the slaughterhouses where blood runs in the gutters. And underneath it all is the smell of the Thames itself, which by the 1850s had become an open sewer, choked with human waste and industrial runoff. This is the East End, home to hundreds of thousands of London's poor. This is Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, Shoreditch. This is where the people who built the wealth of the empire actually lived, and it is a vision of hell. Let us walk down one of these streets together. It is narrow, barely wide enough for a cart to pass. The buildings on either side lean inward, their upper stories almost touching, blocking out the sky. The ground beneath your feet is not paved, or if it once was, the paving has long since been broken and buried under mud and filth. There are puddles everywhere, and you do not want to think about what might be in that water. The buildings are tenements, multi-storey structures divided and subdivided into the smallest possible living spaces. A single room might house an entire family, parents and children and sometimes grandparents, or lodgers as well. All living in a space no bigger than 12 feet by 12 feet. There is no running water in these buildings. Water must be carried from a communal pump in the courtyard, if there is one, or from a street pump blocks away. The pump is only turned on for a few hours each day to conserve water, so there are always long lines of people waiting with buckets and jugs. There are no indoor toilets. Instead, there are privies in the courtyards, usually one for every 20 or 30 families. These are just holes in the ground with wooden seats over them, emptying into cesspits below. The cesspits are supposed to be emptied regularly by night soil men, workers who shovel out human waste and cart it away to be sold as fertiliser. But in the poorest areas, the cesspits overflow constantly, leaking into the groundwater, seeping through the walls of nearby cellars where people live. Look at the windows of these buildings, and you will see that most are broken, stuffed with rags or paper to keep out the cold. There is no glass because glass costs money, and landlords do not repair things in the slums. Inside there is almost no furniture. Perhaps a broken bed frame, perhaps a table made from a plank across two boxes. People sleep on piles of rags or straw on the floor. In winter, entire families huddle together for warmth because there is no coal for a fire. The people you see on these streets are thin, unnaturally so. Malnutrition is universal. Their faces are pale, their eyes often have a strange brightness that comes from constant hunger and disease. The children especially look wrong to your modern eyes. They are small for their age, their growth stunted by lack of food. Many have rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency that bows their legs and deforms their bones. Many have tuberculosis, the white plague, which makes them cough blood into rags. Many will not live to see adulthood. Let me give you some numbers to help you understand the scale of this poverty. In 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition that celebrated Britain's greatness. 1 in 5 Londoners lived in a single room. Not a single-room apartment with a bathroom and kitchen, but literally one room that served as bedroom, kitchen, living room, and workplace all together. By 1881, there were over 900,000 people in London living in overcrowded conditions, defined as more than 2 people per room. In some of the worst areas, like St Giles or Jacob's Island, the density was far worse. 10, 15, even 20 people might be crammed into a single room. And this was not hidden away in some distant slum. These areas of desperate poverty existed just streets away from the wealthy neighbourhoods. A person could walk from the luxury of Mayfair to the squalor of Seven Dials in 15 minutes. The rich and the poor lived in the same city, breathed the same foul air, and yet they might as well have been on different planets. Charles Dickens knew both these worlds intimately. He walked these streets, observed these contrasts, and wrote about them with a clarity that shocked his readers. When he published Oliver Twist in 1837, many people in comfortable homes believed he was exaggerating for dramatic effect. Surely, they thought, London could not really be this bad. Surely no children really lived like Oliver, starving in workhouses, sleeping rough in the streets, falling into the hands of criminals out of sheer desperation. But Dickens was not exaggerating. If anything, he was being gentle. He knew the reality of poverty because he had lived it himself. When Charles Dickens was 12 years old, his father was sent to debtor's prison. Young Charles was taken out of school and sent to work in a blacking factory, a place that made boot polish. He spent 10 hours a day pasting labels onto pots of polish, working alongside other children in a rat-infested warehouse by the Thames. He earned 6 shillings a week, barely enough to pay for a cheap room in a lodging house. The shame and horror of this experience never left him. Every word he wrote about child poverty, about workhouses, about the casual cruelty of Victorian society toward its most vulnerable members, came from a place of deep personal knowledge and rage. And here is the crucial thing to understand about Victorian London. What happened to the young Charles Dickens was not unusual. It was not some terrible exception. It was normal. It was the way society functioned. Children were not seen as innocents to be protected and nurtured. They were seen as small adults, as workers, as economic units who could contribute to the family's survival, or, if they had no family, as problems to be managed as cheaply as possible. Let us talk about the children of Victorian London. Let us understand what childhood actually meant for the majority of young people in the greatest city on earth. We will start with the very youngest, with those who were born into poverty and had no one to protect them. Imagine you are a boy, 6 years old, and you have just been sold to a master chimney sweep. Your parents are not cruel people. They are simply desperate. Your father is a labourer who can barely find work. Your mother takes in washing, but can barely feed the children she already has. When the sweep came knocking, offering a few shillings for a healthy boy, your parents told themselves they were giving you a trade, an opportunity. They told themselves you would be better off. You are not better off. You are now the property of a man who makes his living by sending children up chimneys to clean them. You live in a cellar with a dozen other climbing boys, all between the ages of 5 and 10. You sleep on bags of soot. You are never clean. The soot works its way into your skin, your hair, your lungs. You cough constantly, bringing up black phlegm. Your day begins at 4 in the morning. Your master wakes you by kicking the bag you sleep on. You and the other boys are loaded into a cart with the brushes and sacks, and you are driven through the dark streets to the houses where you will work. You learn quickly that there are 2 kinds of chimneys. Some are relatively wide and straight, and while climbing them is dirty and frightening, it can be done. But many chimneys, especially in newer houses, are built narrow to save on bricks and materials. These chimneys are barely 9 inches wide. They twist and turn. They have sharp angles where the flue changes direction. To climb these chimneys, you must work your way up in darkness, pressing your back against one side and your knees against the other, inching your way upward. The bricks scrape your skin raw. The soot clogs your nose and mouth. You cannot see anything. You can barely breathe. Sometimes you get stuck, wedged in a narrow section, unable to move up or down. When this happens, your master will light a small fire at the bottom of the chimney to encourage you to climb faster. You have seen boys die in chimneys, their bodies recovered only by breaking through the wall. The work ruins your body. Your knees and elbows develop thick calluses that crack and bleed and become infected. You develop what the sweeps call sooty warts, dark growths on your skin that appear wherever the soot has been ground in deepest. You will learn later, if you survive long enough, that sooty wart is actually cancer, that the chimney sweeps have one of the highest rates of scrotal cancer of any profession, the first occupational cancer ever identified in medical history. But you probably will not survive long enough to develop cancer. Most climbing boys die before they reach adulthood. They die from falls, from suffocation, from infections, from tuberculosis, which spreads easily in the soot-filled air of the cellar where you all sleep together. If you do survive to age 10 or 12, you will be too big to fit up the chimneys anymore. Your master will turn you out with nothing, and you will have to find some other way to survive in the city. This was not ancient history. This was happening in London in the 1800s, while Britain was the richest and most powerful nation on earth. The use of climbing boys was well known. It was debated in Parliament. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned against it for decades. But it continued because it was profitable, and because the alternative, mechanical brushes and adult sweeps using rods, was more expensive and less thorough. Homeowners did not want to pay more to have their chimneys cleaned. They did not want to think about the children. Finally, in 1875, an Act of Parliament made it illegal to send boys up chimneys. But the law was difficult to enforce. Masters would claim the boys were apprentices who were merely observing. Some climbing boys continued working into the 1880s, and even when the practice finally ended, those boys who had survived had been so damaged by their years in the chimneys that most died young of lung disease or cancer. The climbing boys were perhaps the most visible symbols of child labour, the ones that reformers pointed to with horror. But they were far from the only children working in dangerous conditions. All over London, in factories and workshops and on the streets, children were labouring in ways that would be unimaginable today. In the match factories of the East End, girls as young as 7 worked 12-hour shifts making matches. They worked in rooms filled with white phosphorus fumes, a toxic chemical that caused a horrific disease called Phossy jaw. The phosphorus would get into their teeth and jawbones, causing them to glow in the dark with a sickly green light. The jaw would decay, becoming infected and gangrenous. The only treatment was to surgically remove the jaw, a procedure that many did not survive. Even those who did were left horribly disfigured, unable to eat or speak properly. The factory owners knew about Phossy jaw. It was well documented. But white phosphorus made a better match than the safer alternatives, and it was cheaper. The factory owners calculated that it was more profitable to pay occasional compensation to the families of girls who died or were maimed than to switch to safer materials. This was the arithmetic of Victorian capitalism. Human lives, especially the lives of poor children, were simply numbers in a ledger. In the textile mills that dotted the city and the industrial north, children worked as scavengers and piecers. Scavengers were the smallest children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, who crawled under the moving machinery to collect loose cotton or to clean up spills. Many were crushed or had their hands torn off by the machinery. Piecers were slightly older children, whose job was to tie together threads that broke on the spinning machines. They had to be quick and their fingers had to be nimble. If they were too slow, they were beaten. Factory overseers carried leather straps specifically for hitting children who did not work fast enough. The Factory Acts, passed in stages throughout the Victorian era, did eventually limit child labour. The 1833 Factory Act prohibited children under 9 from working in textile mills and limited older children to 8 hours a day. But these laws applied only to specific industries and were difficult to enforce. Factory owners lied about children's ages. Parents, desperate for the income, lied as well. And the law said nothing about the many other kinds of work children did. On the streets of London, thousands of children worked in the informal economy, the world of odd jobs and survival that existed below the notice of law and government. There were the crossing sweepers, usually young boys, who would station themselves at busy street corners and sweep a path through the horse manure for pedestrians in exchange for pennies. There were the mudlarks, children who scavenged along the banks of the Thames at low tide, searching through the mud and sewage for anything of value: nails, coal, rope, copper, bits of bone that could be sold to the bone boilers. There were the flower girls and the match girls, young women and girls who stood on street corners selling flowers or matches. though this was often a cover for prostitution. There were the errand boys and messenger boys, running all day through the city, delivering packages and notes. There were the apprentices in workshops, learning trades like shoemaking or tailoring, who were essentially unpaid servants, worked like adults but fed like prisoners. And then there were the children, who had no work at all, who survived by begging or stealing, or by selling the only thing they had themselves. Henry Mayhew, a journalist who documented the lives of London's poor in the 1850s, estimated that there were over 30,000 children living on the streets with no homes and no families. They slept in doorways, under bridges, in markets after the stalls closed. In winter, they would cluster around the warm air vents from bakeries and factories, trying not to freeze to death. Dr. Thomas Barnardo, who would go on to found the famous Barnardo's Children's Charity, was a medical student in London in 1866, when he first encountered the sheer scale of child homelessness. One night he was teaching at a ragged school, a free school for poor children, and when the class ended, he noticed a boy lingering behind. The boy, whose name was Jim Jarvis, was about 11 years old. Barnardo asked him why he had not gone home. Jim replied that he had no home. He slept rough, wherever he could find shelter. Barnardo did not quite believe this, so Jim offered to show him. That night, Jim led Dr. Barnardo through the dark streets to a place near Billingsgate Market. There, on the roof of a warehouse, huddled together for warmth, were 73 homeless boys, all sleeping in the open air. Barnardo was horrified. He asked Jim if there were many more like this. Jim replied that he could show him hundreds, perhaps thousands. This encounter changed Dr. Barnardo's life. He gave up his plans to be a medical missionary in China and instead devoted himself to helping London's homeless children. Over the following decades, his organisation would provide shelter, food, and education to hundreds of thousands of children. But even this massive effort barely made a dent in the problem. For every child Barnardo's could help, there were dozens more still on the streets. Charles Dickens knew these children. He saw them every day on his long walks through London. When he wrote Oliver Twist with its gang of child pickpockets led by the villainous Fagin, he was not inventing a fantasy. He was describing something that actually existed. There really were organised gangs that trained children to steal. There really were adults who exploited vulnerable children, who saw them as useful tools, and discarded them when they were no longer profitable. When Oliver famously holds up his bowl and asks for more gruel in the workhouse, Dickens was making a point about the system itself. The workhouses, institutions designed to house the destitute, deliberately made life so miserable that people would do anything to avoid them. The food was kept to a minimum, just enough to prevent starvation. The work was hard and pointless, like breaking rocks or picking apart old ropes to make oakum, used for caulking ships. Families were separated, with men, women, and children housed in different wings and forbidden from seeing each other. All of this was intentional. The philosophy was that poverty was a moral failure, and that the poor needed to be punished and deterred from relying on charity. But when you are a child, you have not failed. You have simply been born into the wrong circumstances. And yet, Victorian society treated poor children as if their poverty was their own fault, as if a 6-year-old climbing boy or a 10-year-old match girl had somehow chosen their fate. It took decades of work by reformers, journalists and writers like Dickens to slowly shift public opinion, to make people see that children deserved protection, that childhood itself should be a time of safety and education, not brutal labour. The children of Victorian London were victims of a system that valued profit over human life, that saw the poor as a problem to be managed rather than as people to be helped. And while we remember the reformers and the eventual changes they brought about, we must also remember the hundreds of thousands of children who did not survive to see those changes, who lived brief, hard lives in the shadows of the greatest city on earth. Let us turn now to another group of people whose lives were shaped by the cruelty and indifference of Victorian society. Let us talk about the women of London, and in particular about those women who were known in the delicate language of the time as unfortunates. This was the Victorian euphemism for prostitutes, and it was in many ways an accurate term. These women were unfortunate, not because they were immoral or depraved, but because they lived in a society that gave them almost no options, and then condemned them for the choices they were forced to make. To understand prostitution in Victorian London, you must first understand the economics of being a working-class woman in the 19th century. Let us imagine a young woman, perhaps 17 or 18 years old. She has come to London from a village in the countryside because there is no work at home, no way to survive. Like thousands of other young women, she hopes to find work as a domestic servant. This is the most common occupation for working class women. And while the work is hard and the hours are long, it offers a roof over your head and regular meals. She is lucky. She finds a position in a middle-class household as a scullery maid, the lowest rank of servant. She works in the kitchen, washing dishes, scrubbing pots, cleaning the floors on her hands and knees. She earns perhaps £8 or £10 a year, plus her board and lodging. She shares an attic room with 2 other maids. She works from 5 in the morning until 10 or 11 at night. She has 1 half-day off per week. It is exhausting, but it is respectable work, and she sends a few shillings home to her family when she can. But then something happens. Perhaps the son of the house pays her unwanted attention. Perhaps he forces himself on her. Perhaps she is genuinely in love with a young man, a footman or a tradesman, and they have relations before marriage. Either way, she becomes pregnant. The moment her condition is discovered, she is dismissed. No reference will be given. Her name will be blackened. She finds herself on the street with no money, no home and no prospects. No other respectable household will hire her without references. She cannot go home because the shame would destroy her family. She is alone in the city with a baby or a baby on the way, and she needs to eat. She needs somewhere to sleep. This is how it begins for so many women. Not through moral failure or natural depravity, but through a single event that removes them from respectable society forever. Victorian moral codes were unforgiving, especially for women. A man who fathered an illegitimate child faced no real consequences. A woman who bore one became an outcast. So she turns to the only form of work that is available to a woman with no references, no skills, and a ruined reputation. She becomes a prostitute. In Victorian London, prostitution existed on a vast scale and at many different levels. At the top were the courtesans and kept women, mistresses of wealthy men who lived in comfortable apartments and wore fine clothes. These women were a tiny minority. Below them was a complex hierarchy of brothels, from the relatively clean and safe establishments in areas like Haymarket to the dangerous, disease-ridden common lodging houses in the East End. And at the very bottom were the streetwalkers, women who had no fixed place of work and simply walked the streets looking for customers. In the 1850s, it was estimated that there were between 50,000 and 80,000 prostitutes in London. This number is staggering, but it becomes less surprising when you understand the economic realities. A woman working as a seamstress or a laundress might earn 6 shillings a week for 60 or 70 hours of labour. A prostitute could earn that much in a single night. When the choice is between starvation and selling your body, it is not really a choice at all. The geography of prostitution in London was well known. Certain streets and areas were recognised as places where these transactions occurred. The Haymarket was famous, a wide street near the theatres where women in gaudy dresses would promenade in the evening, looking for customers among the theatre-goers and gentlemen out for the night. The Waterloo Road near the railway station was another well-known area. And in the East End, in places like Whitechapel and Spitalfields, prostitution was simply a fact of life, as common as any other form of work. The women who worked the streets faced constant danger. There was the danger of disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea were epidemic and there was no cure. These diseases would slowly destroy the body, causing terrible pain, disfigurement, madness, and eventually death. There was the danger of pregnancy, always a risk despite attempts at prevention, and a pregnant prostitute could not work. There was the danger of violence from customers. Many men felt that because they had paid for a woman's services, they could treat her however they wished. Women were beaten, robbed, sometimes murdered. The police offered little protection. Prostitution itself was not illegal, but the laws around it were used to harass and punish the women involved. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s gave police the power to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and force her to undergo an intimate medical examination. If she was found to have a venereal disease, she could be locked up in a hospital prison until she was deemed cured, which might take months. These laws applied only to women, never to the men who were their customers and who spread the diseases just as much. And then there was the deeper violence of social contempt. Victorian society was deeply hypocritical about sex. Publicly, the ideal was absolute purity, especially for women. Sex was not discussed in polite company. Middle-class women were expected to be completely ignorant of sexual matters until their wedding night. But at the same time, there was a vast underground economy of prostitution, pornography, and sexual exploitation. Thousands of respectable married men regularly visited prostitutes. The same men who would cross the street to avoid acknowledging a fallen woman in daylight would seek her out after dark. This hypocrisy reached its peak in the debates about how to deal with prostitution. The two main positions were represented by two different groups of reformers. On one side were those who believed that prostitutes were victims who needed to be rescued and rehabilitated. This was the approach taken by organisations like the Magdalene Asylums, institutions run by religious groups that took in former prostitutes and tried to reform them. The idea was that these women could be taught to be respectable again through hard work, prayer, and moral instruction. In practice, the Magdalene Asylums were often as bad as prisons. The women were locked in and forced to work long hours in laundries, scrubbing clothes for paying customers, while the institution kept the profits. They were forbidden from leaving, sometimes for years. They were constantly reminded of their shame and depravity. Many women who entered these institutions, hoping for a second chance, found themselves trapped in a different kind of hell, and some ran away back to prostitution because at least on the streets they had their freedom. On the other side were those like Josephine Butler, a remarkable woman who led the campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts. Butler argued that prostitution was not a moral issue, but an economic one, and that the real solution was to give women better options. She fought for women's education, for better wages and working conditions, for laws that would protect women from exploitation. She was vilified for this work, called indecent and unwomanly, for even speaking publicly about such matters. But she persisted, and eventually the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. The lives of prostitutes became a subject of intense public fascination in 1888 with the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. In the autumn of that year, someone murdered and mutilated at least 5 women in Whitechapel, all of them prostitutes. The brutality of the murders and the mystery of the killer's identity captivated the nation. Suddenly everyone was talking about the East End, about the conditions in which these women lived and worked. But here is what often gets forgotten in the endless speculation about the Ripper's identity. These women had names and lives and histories. Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old, the mother of 5 children. She had been married, but her husband left her, probably because of her drinking. She had tried to stay in workhouses and lodging houses, but could not always afford even the few pennies for a bed. On the night she died, she had earned her bed money by selling her hat, then spent it on alcohol, and was back on the streets trying to earn 4p for a bed when she was killed. Annie Chapman was 47. She had been married to a coachman, and they had 3 children together. But after they separated, she fell into poverty and ill health. She suffered from chronic lung disease and malnutrition. On the morning of her death, she was so weak she could barely stand. But she went out anyway, because she needed money for a lodging house bed. These women were not exotic mysteries. They were ordinary people ground down by poverty, illness, and a society that offered them no help. The Ripper murders did briefly shine a light on conditions in the East End, and some reforms followed. But the fundamental problems remained. Women continued to have few options for making a living. Poverty continued to push people into desperate choices. And Victorian society continued to look away, except when something sensational forced them to pay attention. The story of London's prostitutes is ultimately a story about the cruelty of a system that created poverty and desperation, and then blamed the victims for their own suffering. It is a story about how easy it was to fall from respectability into ruin, and how almost impossible it was to climb back up. And it is a reminder that behind the statistics and the euphemisms were real human beings, women who were daughters and mothers and sisters, women who deserved better than the harsh world they were born into. Let us move on to talk about work, about the labour that built Victorian London and made Britain the workshop of the world. We have spoken about the most desperate and exploited workers, the children and the fallen women. But even those who had respectable work, those who laboured in factories and workshops and were paid regular wages, lived lives of grinding hardship that would be unimaginable to us today. Victorian London was a city of makers. Almost everything people used and wore and consumed was made by hand or with the help of simple machines. There were no vast automated factories, no assembly lines in the modern sense. Instead, there were thousands of small workshops and larger factories where skilled and unskilled workers transformed raw materials into finished goods. And the conditions in these places were often as brutal as anything Charles Dickens described. Let us visit a clothing workshop in the East End. The Victorian middle and upper classes had an insatiable appetite for clothes. Fashion was important, a marker of status and respectability. The wealthy would have clothes custom made by tailors and dressmakers. But the growing middle class wanted cheaper ready-made clothing, and this created a huge industry. The workshop is located up a narrow staircase above a shop. It is a single room, perhaps 30 feet by 20 feet, and in this space work 20 women and girls. They are seamstresses, and they are engaged in what is called slop work, the mass production of cheap clothing. Each woman sits at a table with a pile of pre-cut fabric pieces. Using needle and thread, they will sew these pieces together into shirts, dresses, children's clothes. The room is lit by a few small windows and by candles or oil lamps. In summer it is unbearably hot, the air thick and hard to breathe. In winter it is freezing, because coal costs money, and the workshop owner will only allow a small fire. The women work from 7 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night, sometimes later if there is a rush order. They work 6 days a week, and they are paid by the piece, meaning they earn money only for each completed garment. A skilled seamstress working at full speed might complete a dozen shirts in a day. For this she might earn 3 or 4 shillings a week, barely enough to pay for a room in a lodging house and the cheapest food. The work destroys their bodies. They sit hunched over their sewing for 15 hours at a time, their backs bent, their necks craned forward. By candlelight they strain their eyes to see the tiny stitches. Many seamstresses go blind by the age of 30. Their vision ruined by years of close work in poor light. Their hands cramp and their fingers bleed from the constant motion of the needle. Tuberculosis spreads easily in these crowded, poorly ventilated rooms, and many women develop chronic coughs that never go away. In 1843, a magazine called Punch published a poem by Thomas Hood called The Song of the Shirt. It told the story of a seamstress working herself to death, and it became one of the most famous poems of the Victorian era. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, stitch, stitch. In poverty, hunger and dirt. The poem captured the reality of these women's lives so perfectly that it became a rallying cry for reformers. But even as people read the poem and wept over it, the system continued unchanged. The demand for cheap clothing was too great, and the women were too desperate to refuse the work. Across London, in hundreds of other workshops and small factories, similar scenes played out. There were the shoemakers, hunched over their lasts, breathing in the toxic fumes of the glue and dyes they used. There were the hat makers, slowly going mad from mercury poisoning, the source of the phrase, mad as a hatter. There were the printers, their hands permanently stained with ink, breathing in lead dust from the type. There were the workers in the breweries and distilleries, the tanners working with urine and animal hides, the dyers standing in vats of chemicals that burned their skin. And then there were the docks where tens of thousands of men gathered every morning hoping for a day's work. The Port of London was one of the busiest in the world. Ships from every corner of the British Empire, and beyond, arrived daily, carrying tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, wool from Australia, timber from Canada. All of this cargo had to be unloaded by hand, carried from the ships to the warehouses that lined the Thames. The work was irregular and precarious. There were no permanent jobs, no contracts. Every morning, hundreds of men would crowd outside the dock gates. When work was available, a foreman would come out and point at the men he wanted. The chosen few would work for the day, loading or unloading cargo, and at the end of the day, they would be paid a few shillings. The next day, they would have to come back and hope to be chosen again. There was no guarantee of work from one day to the next. The unchosen men, sometimes hundreds of them, would drift away to look for work elsewhere, or simply to wait for the next day. Some would go to the pubs that surrounded the docks and drink away what little money they had, drowning their despair and frustration. The desperation for work led to terrible scenes. Men would fight each other for the foreman's attention. They would bribe the foreman with money they could not afford to spend. The system was corrupt and brutal, designed to keep workers desperate and wages low. Even those with skilled trades were not secure. Economic depressions, which happened regularly throughout the Victorian era, could throw thousands out of work overnight. There was no unemployment insurance, no government support. If you could not work, you could not eat. It was that simple. Many families were only one illness or one accident away from complete destitution. This was the reality of work in Victorian London. It was not noble or dignified. It was a grinding struggle for survival, a daily battle to earn enough to eat and to keep a roof over your head. The lucky few had steady work and a regular wage. The vast majority lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing if tomorrow would bring work or hunger. And over all of it hung the knowledge that if you failed, if you could not work, the only place left to go was the workhouse, an institution designed to be so terrible that people would endure almost anything to avoid it. Now let us talk about the Thames itself, the great river that was the lifeblood of London and also one of its greatest sources of misery. In the early Victorian era, the Thames was a working river, crowded with ships and boats and barges. It was also the city's sewer. Every day, millions of gallons of human waste, industrial pollution, and refuse poured into the river from the streets and buildings that lined its banks. By the 1850s, the Thames had become so polluted that it was essentially a giant open cesspit flowing through the heart of the city. The smell was overwhelming, especially in summer. It was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The stench would drift through the streets, seeping into buildings and homes. People genuinely believed that diseases were caused by bad air, by miasma, and the air around the Thames was as bad as it could possibly be. The crisis reached its peak in the summer of 1858, in what became known as the Great Stink. That summer was unusually hot, and the heat caused the sewage in the Thames to ferment. The smell became so bad that it was impossible to ignore. Even Parliament, which sat in buildings right on the riverbank, could not continue its business. MPs soaked the curtains in chloride of lime to try to mask the smell, but it was no use. They seriously considered abandoning London entirely and moving the government to another city. The Great Stink finally forced action. For years, engineers and reformers had been proposing solutions to London's sewage problem, but they were expensive, and politicians had been reluctant to spend the money. Now, with the stench making the city uninhabitable, something had to be done. The solution came from a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. His plan was ambitious and elegant. He would build a massive network of underground sewers that would intercept the waste before it reached the Thames and carry it downstream to treatment plants far outside the city. The construction of Bazalgette's sewer system took years and required digging up large portions of the city. But when it was completed, it transformed London. The Thames slowly became cleaner. The constant outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, which had killed tens of thousands, became less frequent. The sewer system is still in use today, one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian age. But it is worth remembering that it took the discomfort of wealthy politicians to finally make it happen. The poor had been dying of waterborne diseases for decades, but only when the smell reached Parliament did the government act. The story of the Thames is a perfect metaphor for Victorian London itself. Here was a city of incredible wealth and power, the capital of the largest empire the world had ever seen, and yet its people were literally living in their own filth, breathing poisoned air, drinking contaminated water. The contrast between the grand buildings and the squalid reality of daily life was almost impossible to reconcile, and yet slowly things began to change. The reforms did come, though they came painfully slowly, and often only after tragedy forced action. The Public Health Acts of the 1840s and 1850s began to give local governments the power and responsibility to provide clean water and sanitation. The Factory Acts gradually reduced the worst abuses of child labour. The Education Acts of the 1870s and 1880s made elementary education compulsory and free, giving working-class children their first real chance at literacy and a better life. These changes did not come from the goodness of the ruling class's hearts. They came because of the tireless work of reformers, journalists and activists who documented the suffering and demanded change. They came because of people like Charles Dickens, who used his enormous fame and talent to shine a light on the darkest corners of his society. They came because of people like Dr. Barnardo, who saw homeless children and devoted his life to helping them. They came because of people like Josephine Butler, who fought for women's rights, even when society condemned her for it. And the changes came because eventually, even the wealthy and powerful realised that a society built on such extreme inequality and suffering was not sustainable. The fear of revolution, the fear that the desperate masses might rise up as they had in France or in other parts of Europe, was a powerful motivator for reform. So was the gradual expansion of the vote, which gave working-class men a political voice for the first time. By the end of Victoria's reign in 1901, Britain was a very different place from the country she had inherited in 1837. But we must not let the story of progress obscure the reality of what came before. For millions of people, Victorian London was a place of terrible suffering. The children who died in the chimneys, the women who died of starvation or disease on the streets, the workers who spent their lives in poverty and died in workhouses, they did not live to see the reforms. Their lives were sacrificed on the altar of industrial progress and imperial expansion. Charles Dickens understood this. He wrote his books not just to entertain, but to bear witness, to ensure that the suffering he saw would be remembered and would mean something. When we read Oliver Twist or Bleak House or Hard Times today, we are reading the testimony of someone who walked those streets, who saw that suffering firsthand, and who refused to look away. And this brings us to the question that has perhaps been forming in your mind as you have listened to this story. How could this happen? How could a society that considered itself the most civilised in the world, that prided itself on British values of fair play and decency, allow such conditions to exist? How could wealthy people live in comfort just streets away from such desperate poverty and not feel compelled to do something about it? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to ideology and self-interest. The Victorian era was dominated by a set of beliefs that we might find shocking today. There was a widespread belief that poverty was the result of moral failure, that the poor were poor because they were lazy or drunken or improvident. The wealthy had earned their position through hard work and virtue. The poor deserved their fate because they lacked these qualities. This ideology was convenient for the wealthy because it absolved them of responsibility. If poverty was a moral failing, then helping the poor too much would only encourage their bad habits. This was the logic behind the harsh conditions in workhouses, behind the opposition to minimum wages or limits on working hours. Any attempt to improve conditions for workers was seen as interfering with the natural laws of economics, as encouraging dependency rather than self-reliance. Religion played a complicated role. Many of the most dedicated reformers were motivated by Christian charity and a genuine belief that all people were equal in the eyes of God. But religion was also used to justify the status quo. The poor were told to accept their lot with patience and humility, to look forward to their reward in heaven, rather than demanding justice on earth. The hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful included a verse that said, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly, and ordered their estate." This verse, sung in churches throughout Britain, taught that social inequality was divinely ordained and should not be questioned. There was also simple ignorance. Many wealthy Victorians genuinely did not know how the poor lived. They never visited the slums. They never spoke to factory workers or seamstresses. Their only contact with the working class was through their servants, who were carefully selected and trained to be invisible and deferential. It was possible to live your entire life in London and never see the worst poverty, if you stayed in the right neighbourhoods and looked the other way at the right times. But perhaps most importantly, there was fear. The wealthy were terrified of social unrest, of revolution, of the masses rising up to take what they had. This fear was not irrational. There had been revolutions across Europe in 1848. There were Chartist demonstrations in Britain demanding political reform and workers' rights. The comfortable classes lived with the knowledge that their comfort depended on keeping millions of people in poverty, and that those people might one day refuse to accept that arrangement. This fear led to contradictory policies. On one hand, there was harsh repression. Strikes were illegal. Political organising was suppressed. The police and the army were used to break up demonstrations. On the other hand, there were concessions and reforms, enough to take the edge off the worst grievances, to prevent revolution by offering gradual improvement. The ruling class walked a tightrope, trying to maintain their position while avoiding the explosion of anger that might destroy them. And so Victorian London was a city of contradictions. It was a place where magnificent buildings stood next to slums, where great fortunes were made on the labour of people who could barely afford to eat, where the same society that produced Charles Darwin and Florence Nightingale and Isambard Kingdom Brunel also sent children up chimneys and let women die in the streets. It was a city that believed itself to be the pinnacle of civilization, while resting on foundations of cruelty and exploitation. But here is what we must remember. The people who lived through this, the poor and the suffering and the exploited, they were not passive victims. They fought back in whatever ways they could. Workers formed illegal unions and went on strike even when it meant arrest. Women supported each other, shared what little they had, created networks of mutual aid. Children found moments of play and joy, even in the darkest circumstances. People survived, and some even found ways to thrive through courage and resilience and solidarity. And slowly, painfully, they changed the world. The reforms that came by the end of the Victorian era, the laws protecting children and workers, the public health improvements, the expansion of education, none of these happened by accident. They happened because ordinary people refused to accept that the world had to be the way it was. They happened because people like the Match Girls, who went on strike in 1888, demanding better conditions and winning, proved that workers had power when they stood together. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, Britain was still deeply unequal. There was still poverty, still exploitation, still injustice. But the worst excesses of early Victorian capitalism had been curbed. Child labour was restricted, working hours were limited, education was available, public health had improved dramatically. These victories were incomplete and imperfect, but they were real, and they came from decades of struggle by people whose names we will never know. As we come to the end of our journey through Victorian London, I want you to think about what this history means. It is easy to look back at the past and feel superior, to congratulate ourselves on how much better things are now. And in many ways, things are better. No one in Britain today faces the kind of poverty that was routine in Victorian times. We have a welfare state, labour laws, universal education and healthcare. But the fundamental questions that Victorian London raised are still with us. How do we balance economic growth with human welfare? How do we ensure that the benefits of prosperity are shared fairly? What responsibilities do the wealthy have to the poor? How do we create a society that values human dignity over profit? These are not historical questions. They are questions we are still struggling with today, in Britain and around the world. Victorian London can teach us something important. It shows us what happens when a society prioritises wealth and power over the well-being of its people. It shows us the human cost of inequality. But it also shows us that change is possible, that ordinary people have the power to transform even the most unjust systems if they are willing to fight for it. Charles Dickens spent his career trying to make his readers see the poor as human, beings as people with feelings and hopes and dignity, not as problems or statistics or moral failures. He wanted to break through the comfortable indifference of the wealthy and force them to confront the suffering they were complicit in. And he succeeded, at least partially. His books were read by millions. They changed how people thought about poverty and social responsibility. But Dickens would be the first to say that reading about injustice is not enough. His books were meant to inspire action, not just sentiment. The real heroes of Victorian London were not the writers or the politicians, but the ordinary people who struggled every day to survive and to make things better. The mothers who worked themselves to exhaustion to feed their children. The workers who risked everything to demand fair treatment. The reformers who devoted their lives to helping others. These people built the better world that would come after them, even though many of them did not live to see it. They are the ones we should remember when we think about Victorian London, not just the famous names or the dramatic events, but the millions of unknown people whose lives and struggles shaped history. And so we come to the end of our walk through the streets of Victorian London. The fog is lifting now. The gas lamps are being extinguished with the coming dawn. The city is waking up to another day of toil and struggle, of small victories and grinding defeats, but also of human connection, of kindness in the face of cruelty, of hope despite everything. This was Victorian London. Not the romantic fantasy of Sherlock Holmes or the Christmas cards, but the real city where real people lived real lives. A city of contrasts and contradictions, of terrible suffering and remarkable resilience. A city that was both the best and the worst of humanity, often existing side by side on the same street.